Ahead of the Nevada caucus, Bernie Sanders is the frontrunner for the Democratic nomination, but there are also growing concerns of a contentious Democratic convention if the Vermont senator fails to actually get a delegate majority.
So here to expand on this and the upcoming Nevada contest is political reporter at Huffington Post, Daniel Marans. He joins us now via Skype from Las Vegas. Great to have you, Dan.
Great to be here.
Good to see you.
All right, so how do you see this all playing out? Because I would say there's a decent likelihood at this point that Sanders wins a plurality of the delegates, but not enough to win an outright majority on the first ballot. What does your reporting tell you about how this might play out?
Well, yeah, I think that it's obviously still quite early, but I think that there are definitely some people who support Bernie Sanders who looked at the New Hampshire primary margin and said, wow, if this field stays fractured and support doesn't consolidate around him, we could be looking at a guy who coasts along at between 25 and 30%. I don't want to sort of overemphasize it because, again, it is relatively early, but it would basically be a situation where Bernie Sanders goes into the convention in July in Milwaukee with a plurality of delegates, meaning he has more than anybody else. He probably has more of a claim to the nomination than any other candidate, but it also means that he would not be walking in with an outright majority on the first ballot. And I think it's important for people to understand just why that's significant. And that's because Bernie and actually the Democratic National Committee, at Bernie's behest, including Tom Perez, pushed through a set of reforms that basically said those old superdelegates, those elected officials and Democratic Party insiders who used to be free to cast their votes in a Democratic National Convention for essentially whoever they wanted. Now, they claim that they would never contradict the will of the party's rank and file voters, but it certainly created a sort of air of inevitability around Hillary Clinton in 2016. They would be forced to go with the pledged delegate vote in the first round this time.
Right.
But if a single candidate didn't get a majority in that first round, they would be free to sort of vote however they want. Now, my sense is that most folks inside Bernie Sanders' inner circle are not yet freaking out about this. I would say the highest ranking person I spoke to on that front is, of course, Congressman Ro Khanna, and he just sort of said they're going with the plurality, whether they like it or not.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the interesting thing, Dan, is not only with the superdelegates, but we've covered on this show about how the convention itself is stacked with people like Barney Frank and other people on many of these committees, and that's actually the mechanics through which a contested convention works. Another thing I am wondering about is what if, and this is what I've been looking at, if Michael Bloomberg is able to come in with not a majority, maybe the second most amount, but if he could pick a consensus type candidate, then he would very much be in a position to try and swing these voters. And I just saw this morning that Stacey Abrams apparently had very nice things to say about Mr. Bloomberg on The View yesterday. I'm sure it has nothing to do with the $5 million that he donated to her organization.
Yeah, so I think that the Mike Bloomberg factor is huge here, right? He's shown in just, what, a month or two an ability to bring himself into double digits in the polls. A lot of people were remarking on the fact that Andrew Yang was able to outlast senators and governors. But here we have a figure who engaged in sort of stop and frisk practices that were struck down in the federal courts, effectively tasking his police force with stopping predominantly black and Latino young men without probable cause, and of course surveilling the Muslim population in New York City. And he is able to generate double-digit support in states with huge minority populations, largely just by going on air on TV and racking up these endorsements from people whose nonprofits he's donated to. I think that is definitely the role he is trying to play in some form, which is to say, if he can't win outright, can he form a bloc that's large enough that they get to the convention and some of these superdelegates and Democratic Party brokers and officials, people on the Rules Committee, as you mentioned, who were largely appointed by Tom Perez, come from those ranks of lobbyists and insiders who might be able to then justify themselves to say, look, Bernie Sanders is coming in here with a plurality, but you know what? We wouldn't be thwarting a quote-unquote majority of the Democratic Party electorate if we handed it to Bloomberg, or if we found a compromise candidate by saying, well, you know, Bloomberg has 20, Bernie Sanders has 25. Who's to say, really?
Right.
And Dan, how do you think that would go for the Democratic Party, based on your reporting, if Bernie wins a plurality and the nomination is given to someone else?
I mean, I think it would be a disaster. I think it would make the Iowa caucuses look like a shining success, effectively. You already have Donald Trump saying that the system is once again being rigged against Bernie Sanders. He actually kind of had a funny sort of stand-up comedy line where he said, Democrats are worried that the Democrats said, oh, this Iowa caucus thing is a gift to Donald Trump. And then he pauses and he's like, they're right. This is we already have on the Democratic Party side, much as there existed sort of on the Republican side prior to Trump, a deep disconnect between many rank and file supporters or many rank and file progressives who don't even want to affiliate it with the party, but had hoped that they might find a home there under Bernie Sanders. There are obviously people even in Bernie's camp who would be extremely unhappy if he lost fair and square, and I don't want to discount that. But there is so much confusion in this prolonged process, given the role of insiders and given the role of sort of just arcane election rules like the caucus system,
right?
That it would sow incredible distrust, and the nominee would be going into a general election with an incredibly fractured contest and a fractured body politic. And that's sort of the case that Ro Khanna and others were making to me. And frankly, Jim Zogby as well, he's another person who's in Bernie's camp. He basically said Jim McGovern, people point to Jim McGovern in 1972 as a progressive nominee who sort of party insider types don't want to repeat that mistake by nominating somebody like that. And that's what explains so much of their sort of suspicion towards Sanders. But Zogby said, I was around then. The party sank Jim McGovern, not the other way around, because they refused to rally behind him at that convention.
Interesting. Last question for you, Dan, about some of your reporting on the ground there. Of course, we covered extensively the culinary union and how they, attacked Bernie on Medicare for All, ultimately decided not to endorse anyone in the race. They were never going to endorse him anyway, so the fact that they didn't endorse was really a win for his camp. But they've been critical of Medicare for All. Meanwhile, another big union in Las Vegas has backed Bernie Sanders, the teachers union there. Talk about why they seem comfortable and in favor of Medicare for All where other unions have not been.
Yeah, it's such an interesting case. It's the Clark County Education Association, and actually they disaffiliated from the International Union, which is something I learned recently. So that sort of speaks to one of the reasons why they're more comfortable taking that independent stance. But unlike the Culinary Union, which enjoys huge density despite being in a right to work state where they can't compel dues payment from workers that they represent, they are 30,000 members, or at least they represent 30,000 workers, but they've been in a prolonged battle with the Clark County School District over things like their healthcare benefits, and they've had to accept concessions, which is sort of the exact scenario that Bernie Sanders and other progressives warn about when discussing the advantages of Medicare for All for labor unions. You might be a labor union riding high, like the Culinary Union is, vis-a-vis the casino and hotel industry, but by the same token, 5-10 years from now, you might be a union like the teachers union in Clark County, which has been forced to accept concessions on its healthcare plan that make it only a little bit more attractive than one of the Obamacare exchange plans. And so they're looking at this and saying, we don't really have a whole lot to lose, and we'd be very happy to take it off the negotiating table.
Yeah, that's very interesting. All right, Dan, thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
All right, great to be here.
Next on Rising, senior reporter for Reveal, Aaron Glantz. He breaks down Bloomberg's comments on redlining when Rising continues.